my own family, I realised that my Uncle John, who famously in 1931 went out to Munich as a young man, as they did then, and took his first driving lesson in Munich, went round a corner a bit fast, and the driving instructor said, "Oh my God, that was Hitler." And my uncle had nearly killed Adolf Hitler, which would have been rather a high score, but unfortunately failed to kill him. And that's a story that's very well known by everybody and has been told very well by Craig Brown, for example, at the beginning of his circular history. He began and ended it with my uncle in Munich. But what everybody does not know, because they aren't my family, is that my Uncle John stayed on and fell completely in love with a beautiful German girl called Nochi Harach. And in 1934, my 11-year-old mother, very excited, went out to Munich just after the Night of the Long Knives and saw my uncle getting married, and she was a little bridesmaid with a huge sheaf of gladioli, which is the main thing she remembered. And then I said, "Well, what else do you remember?" And she remembered the megaphones on the corner and Hitler's voice saying, "We have done the right thing, we have saved Germany with the assassinations." But what really interested me was the fact that my family had banished all their connection with the German cousins, because my Uncle John and Aunt Nochi lived in England. I had a whole mass of German cousins living around Munich. And none of us, when I was a child, had even met a German. My first encounter with a German when I was 11 years old was going to stay with a Norfolk cousin who said with absolute awed tones, Miranda, we've got a German staying in the house. You can touch him." And we both crept up on, he was called Francis Stauffenberg, and very shy at about 16, and we crept up and touched his arm.
Probably didn't help his shyness.
No, well, my cousin, I was so jealous of. They were doing a home swap, so my English cousin was going to stay with him, and she was allowed to sit next to Francie in the car going back to Germany, so she touched his arm some more. All very innocent. But as you can see, the Germans to our family were other. And I grew up with this great curiosity about the German family and wanting to find out more about them. So that was one part of the story, and that took me out to Munich and finding this beautiful neglected garden, which had been the garden where the wedding had taken place, and with all the sculptures done by my German aunt's father, who was a talented sculptor. Nothing had been bombed. It was all exactly as it had been. And one of those moments for a writer when you just think, oh, it's just so exciting, I'm touching the past. But also partly because I live in a part of North London that was very much the area of Jewish immigrants, and my former husband was Jewish, and therefore my father-in-law, who's a dear man, had come over on the Kindertransport. I came to hear a great deal about Germany from their point of view, and what interested me was that when I was talking to this North London Jewish community, their feeling about England and Germany was absolutely one of affection and interest and a desire that the past should be put to rest. They said, yes, what was done was unforgivable in 1933, but it was 12 years. Let it take its place in the long history. But when I talk to English people, not Jewish people, and particularly actually country people, I would find them stiffening and saying, do you mean you want to write about all that? Do you want to go to Germany? And why would you want to go to Germany? And quite quickly the subject of the Nazis would come up, and I would realize that this problem had not gone away. And I read about a wonderful man called Herbert Sulzbach, who really was the inspiration for my book. And he was a German Jew who fought in the First World War for Germany, came back in 1918 saying, we are undefeated, we are the Germans. Then came over in the emigration to England and was interned. When he came out of his internment, he asked to be sent into the camps to work with the leading German Nazi prisoners and to re-educate them. And it became his life's work. He was incredibly successful. one of his converts became the mayor of Frankfurt. And he did an extraordinary job in enlightening the Nazis about British democracy and how it could work. But in 1984, the year before he died, he went on television to say that nothing had changed. Despite all his endeavours, the old distrust was still there. And I find that in 2013, on the brink of our great memory of the First World War, yet again we are picking at the festering wounds and looking for trouble, not peace. None of us learnt this at school. It wasn't part of our education. Germany dropped off the agenda. And the purpose of my book, which turned out to be like going to school again for me, it was such an education, was to talk about this amazing 300-year history, which, as you rightly say, had a very natural beginning in 1613, when Elizabeth Stuart, the daughter of James I, very, very shaky Protestant power in England still, where, you know, it had only just been established by the Tudors and everything was still insecure, and Europe was full of Catholic powers. So they looked for a Protestant power to make an alliance with, and found, it was so romantic, the young Frederick, the Elector Palatine, who fell completely in love with Elizabeth, married her on Valentine's Day, and John Donne wrote the poem that celebrated the marriage of the Thames and the Rhine. Elizabeth went out to Germany and actually built in Heidelberg the home for Shakespeare's players in the year the Globe Theatre had been burned down. So this was a wonderful start for the story, where England came out to Germany with Shakespeare and with her, and it was her grandson, George I, who became the first of the Hanoverians. So that's where it all began. It's one of those aspects which came as a great surprise to me, that as we know, George Eliot and Lewis, who was a great Germanophile and actually was preparing to write the life of Goethe, but they weren't married. And in England, this was tremendously disgraceful. And also, George Eliot had just translated under an anonymous name two very, very, very revolutionary German works, which were books that were against the Christian story. So possibly she needed to leave England anyway. Possibly she and Lewis just wanted to have a lovely romantic time together in a country where it was not shocking to be a couple who weren't married. It was quite the norm. And they went out to Weimar, where Lewis was going to research his book. And they had a blissful time there. And one of the things that I found very touching was Goethe writing to Thackeray, who'd been out there before him. And I always thought of Thackeray as rather a sort of stiff old creature. But somehow Lewis's letter saying, "What do you remember of your years at Weimar?" coaxed Thackeray in London into this wonderful reminiscent moment when he wrote about how he remembered staying in Weimar with about 26 young Englishmen who would all troop off and meet up with Goethe and go up to the palace for dinner. And he had one night been asked up to the palace for a ball. And he said, well, the trouble was you always had to wear court dress or something military, and I hadn't got anything military. So I bought an old dress sword of Schiller's, and think of it, you know, Schiller, and I put on a tight cummerbund and stuck Schiller's dress sword through it. And then he wrote to Lewis, I hung it up on my wall when I came home to England, and I have it here still to remind me of the dearest, happiest, most innocent place, Weimar of all places, that I can ever remember having visited. And that just touched me to the quick. What was done in those 12 years should never be forgiven or forgotten. But all I'm asking is that we put it into the perspective of this 400 years of the exchange of music, philosophy, gardens, literature. Everything that we are has been contributed to in an enormous part by Germany. And this, I would have to say, obsession with the Nazis, where 3 years ago, 850 books were published in the UK simply about the Nazis. It's the most taught subject in school, it remains that. and nobody really knows anything else about Germany at all. That's a real shame. There is always a moment when I just, it sounds a bit of a missionary statement, but there's a moment when I feel something or somebody, in this case rather ambitiously, two countries' history, needs rescuing. And whether it's writing about a Bugatti racing driver, or Ottilie Murrell, a maligned Bloomsbury hostess, or about a lost history, there is always a moment when that becomes the main thing. And I think what was really lucky for me in doing this book is because I've been writing biography for a long time. I guess I do have a skill and a love of storytelling where I could look for the story that is the key story for each period, because it's chronological, told through stories going to and fro. And I'd say that's probably a learned technique, that I just know which story will bring the point home most powerfully for me, and therefore I hope for other people.
So it's been 5 years in the making of this book, but perhaps a whole career as well in some way.
In a sense, I didn't think about that until the end, and then I suddenly realised how many of my other books have fed into this, and how much when I was writing about Mary Shelley, and Mary Shelley going out to the Rhine in Geneva, setting Frankenstein in Germany. And I thought, goodness, this has all been there all the time. I just didn't realise it. But that's what writing is.